In the past few years, the word slop has risen in prominence with connections to artificial intelligence and the respective content resulting from it. Whether it's writing, videos, or images, I would argue that none of these AI creations are produced with direct intention or meaning in mind. Slop content, in this context, is simultaneously entertaining and useless, careless when it comes to strengthening literacy or artistry. While you could technically consider this a piece of art, it belongs to the low culture, accessible to the masses, but lacking the intellectualism confined to the high culture. Actually, when it comes to AI, I think it breaks through the barriers of these labels and sinks into an even lower category. I guess that would be called brain rot, but I'm just going to call it the void because it's endless and it means nothing. But I think the term slop, like the term communism or fascism, has become highly overused to the point where it negates all meaning. So for the sake of this video title making sense, I'm going to leave AI slop in the void and put slop films in the low to middle tier, with a focus on their insignificance to the cinematic canon. Okay, quick disclaimer. If you couldn't already tell, I'm going to sound very pretentious. Like, bear with me, but we are going into the snobbish intellectualism trenches here.
The economic modalities, especially in the southern colonies, could most aptly be characterized as agrarian pre-capital.
Okay, back to what I was saying. So, for example, when I pull up Netflix and scroll through all of these original Netflix shows and movies, many of which I've never heard of, maybe I click on one that looks compelling or has a recognizable actor in the thumbnail. But I'm not expecting much out of it. In fact, I might even be majorly disappointed. That's what I would call slop. At the same time, there are movies on here that are considered a part of the theoretical cinematic canon. Not to say that the cinematic canon determines whether or not a film is good or bad, because that's getting into a whole nother realm of pretentiousness. But there are movies on here that I would call essential, in an albeit film bro-ish type of way. Think Taxi Driver, Pulp Fiction, Whiplash. They're usually older movies that make you think of going to a movie theater or talking to someone at a party who looks like me. Not to say that there aren't great Netflix original movies, Power of the Dog, Roma, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, but they are what I would call festival movies, produced or acquired by Netflix in part to compete with other traditional production companies like A24 or Neon, intending to win awards or receive critical notoriety. Then there are these neutral movies to kind of fill in the cracks, and there are a lot of cracks. Okay, we're gonna take a trip to the whiteboard real quick. Don't fall, don't fall, don't fall. Hi, I'm a visual learner, so we're gonna break it down on the whiteboard. So, according to this list I found on IMDb, from 2015 to December 2024, there were 617 original film titles released by Netflix, not including original TV series. Beautiful. I'm sure this list is probably missing some movies, but let's just say for the sake of my time and sanity that it's more or less pretty exhaustive. A 6.8 or higher on IMDb is a pretty well-liked film. Keep in mind that IMDb is a user-based average, while something like Rotten Tomatoes is a critic-based percentage, so I am leaning towards an audience score for this example. Anyways, out of all of those 617 movies made by Netflix, only 110 of them are rated 6.8 or higher. So out of all of these films, only 17% of them are considered good movies. Get rid of this. Okay, I'm not the best at math, but if my calculations were correct, for every one good film, Netflix makes 4 to 5 more bad films. In 2024, Netflix released 62 movies, again, not even including their original shows, 8 of which were rated 6.8 or higher on IMDb. To put that into perspective, let's look at other traditional movie studios. Okay, in 2024, MGM distributed or produced 11 movies, 5 of which were rated 6.8 or higher on IMDb. Paramount produced or distributed 18 movies, 6 of which were rated 6.8 or higher on IMDb. Universal made 20 movies, 8 of which were rated 6.8 or higher on IMDb. A24 had 20 movies, 10 of which were 6.8 or higher I'm kind of in the way of everything, am I not? Yes. Neon produced or made 15 movies, 2 of which were rated 6.8 or higher. Usually Neon's pretty good. Neon was very varied when I was looking at it, so I don't know what is happening there. But anyways, why did I put these so close together? Okay, you know what? I'm gonna rewrite this because it's annoying me. Okay, I'm back and I've rewritten everything. You know what? I don't know if it's even better. Okay, I also have some percentages to show you. All right, with this information, I've calculated a percentage. Hopefully I did it right. But if I did it right, this should represent the amount of movies released by MGM that were considered good by my metric right now in this specific context. 45% of the movies released by MGM in 2024 were considered good. Let's move on to Paramount. 33% were considered good. Universal, 40% were considered good. A24, 50%. All right, our outlier here is Neon. Unfortunately, Neon was weird because it had differing Rotten Tomatoes scores and IMDb scores. So I don't know what's up with that, but they get 13%. Guess who's the same? Netflix gets a 13%. I think the average amount of movies produced by these companies is around 18. And then we have 62 movies produced by Netflix. Only 13% of them were considered good. Okay, keep in mind, this is all in a bubble which doesn't even include critic scoring, and also it doesn't take into account other streaming original titles. But I'm just going to use Netflix as the punching bag here and say that there seems to be a trend wherein this particular streaming service is producing a lot of movies as compared to these other production companies. So why is Netflix making around 70% more movies than average film productions in just 1 year, when 87% of their films from that year are mediocre at best? First, let's have a talk about mass production. And I think it's important to keep the idea of choice in mind. In late medieval Europe, before the printing press, books, and by books I mainly mean religious texts to be distributed and read by scholars and monks, were hand-copied. Apart from being a tedious process, the materials used were expensive, thus the books themselves were costly and limited to certain locations. So, as you can imagine, a printing press streamlining the process made books cheaper and more accessible to these scholars and monks, as well as the average person. Books were printed on thin paper instead of parchment and made smaller and portable. With the introduction of humanism and the general consensus that society, not just monks, scholars, and the elites, should know more things, an increased amount of information and subsequent literacy expanded to other people. This is good, at the cost of having books look like this instead of this. You know how picture books are for babies and comic books aren't literature? Well, tell that to a bishop from the 1400s who just commissioned a manuscript. The aesthetics of illumination, or the process of lighting up each individual manuscript with colorful art and gold leaf, was initially replicated and eventually eliminated as printing became more prevalent. Of course, illumination can be compared to the modern concept of illustration for children's books. But illumination in medieval times was a very individual process. Take a look at these 2 books of hours, each commissioned by a different person, made by a different scribe, and illuminated by an additional individual. Before printing, making books was an act personalized to the scribe, illuminator, and the commissioner. I say this all through a romantic lens, not excusing, of course, how books, specifically the prayer books shown here, were exclusive to the people who could afford to have them made. The process also put the scribes and illuminators through tedious labor for unfair pay as well as no credit. Nevertheless, it makes me wonder if any part of this technique could have been preserved while still mass-producing a product for all. But therein lies the problem, when the book is defined as an external, quantifiable product at the expense of the internal quality of its artistry. While initially there existed a choice between handmade and printed books in the early days of the printing press, soon handmade books became obsolete along with the craftsmanship utilized to create them. But who cares? The past is the past, right? Alright, well, let's look at Netflix again. When discussing Netflix's 2022 adaptation of The Sandman, in an article for Vice, Greta Jackson writes about the Netflix look. Although it's hard to pinpoint what exactly makes all Netflix shows look the same, a few things stand out. The image in general is dark, and the colors are extremely saturated. Especially in scenes at night, there tends to be a lot of colored lighting, making everything look like it's washed in neon even if the characters are inside. So let's start with the camera issue here because it's kind of part of the problem. If we take a look at Netflix's website, they have a list of selected cameras meant for their original content. Quote, "To help creatives produce their best work and create compelling visual experiences for our audience, Netflix requires 90% of a program's final total runtime to be captured on approved cameras, using the following capture requirements." What this really signifies is that they want all of their content shot in 4K. Well, that's fine and dandy until you combine the higher level of detail that 4K offers with cheaper sets, unrealistic wardrobes, last-minute CGI, simplistic 3-point lighting setups, etc. All this to say there's a lot that goes into making a scene, let alone a shot, and the camera is not a device to be entirely reliant on. Furthermore, there's a great deal of work that goes into making a scene believable within the language of the film, and here we detour to the next issue, lighting. So, by the language of the film, I mean the intentional, keyword intentional, means of communication each film employs in order to convey something to its viewer. That can be everything from camera movement and angles to color and lighting. Think of a film with particular conventions. Maybe it starts out with high-key lighting, then deviates from those expectations it set up, shifting to low-key lighting with higher contrast. That communicates something to the viewer. Maybe something about the story has shifted, or one of the characters is not who they seemed. Take a look at this still from Netflix's original movie, Damsel. I'm no expert on lighting, bear in mind. Look how I'm lit right now. And I'm being pretty nitpicky, but here's a shot where the main character, Princess Elodie, played by Millie Bobby Brown, is in this dark cave and her face is lit like this. And the previous shot looks like this. But the key light on her face in the following shot is so obviously a big white LED light. Sure, maybe this bluish white tone is coming from the moonlight creeping in at the top of the cave, but I'm not really seeing that here. The color of the light, as well as the even way it hits her face, just doesn't make sense naturally or even artistically. But then again, I don't really know what they were going for here. Just so I can make this make sense, I'll turn to this moment from Pan's Labyrinth when Ophelia is about to exit her room into this mystical cavern. The lighting in her room when we see her opening the door is a similar kind of pale blue moonlight. It's natural and we can discern where the moonlight might be because of the way it hits her face. But when she opens the door, the lighting grows warm, inviting her into this magical world as well as signaling potential danger. So why couldn't that be the case here? There's something new happening, so why is the light not reflecting that? And look at this shot, where this evil queen, I actually don't really know who she is because I didn't watch the movie, but she looks evil. She's saying, "Seize her!" And her face is just lit in this flat red because she's evil and red bad. It's kind of dark, but not at the same time. Like her whole face is lit up, and I don't know if it's something going on with the fill light, blending out the shadows, or if it's the color grading, maybe it's a mixture, but everything looks kind of muddy. There's no definitive choice being made here, thus the lighting doesn't quite reflect the intensity of the scene. There is hard light here, I guess, and what I mean is that some thought went into having a light positioned so that it defined certain parts of this character's face, but I would really kind of consider this to be a softer or neutral light, which is fine for most scenes, but not necessarily when you have a character storming through a castle. Hello, editor voiceover from the future. So obviously there's a lot of nuance to this discussion, and there are many complexities that exist in the world of lighting setups, and I've kind of dumbed them down here, so I'm sorry. But what I'm predominantly attempting to convey is that the main source of light, from what I could gather, is closer to the actor's face, producing a lack of harsh and defined areas of light and more gradation, or a gradual shift between colors as well as highlights and shadows. What we get from that is this muddy kind of in-between image that is on the borderline of harsh and soft. It kind of just looks like light was blasted directly at her face and everything is diffused so much that we get no contrast. Removing the colors, lighting-wise, this looks similar if not the same to this, and that's boring. And you could say, oh well, this is just one Netflix blockbuster film that looks like this. Well, consider these films that came out in the last few years. Now, compare them to blockbuster films that came out even earlier. These newer movies kind of all have the same lighting, don't they? And I haven't even gotten into conventional framing and camera movement. Think of each film shot as its own painting, which needs to be planned and reset almost every time before the camera starts rolling again. It's tedious, hard work, but you get something really beautiful out of it. A good film, from the lighting to the framing to the sets and CGI, is planned out before that camera rolls. But with the streamlined process of production, shortcuts are being taken, definitive stylistic choices are less common, and each product starts to reflect the manufacturing process instead of an individual artistic voice. Sound familiar? But all this doesn't really answer my question. Why is Netflix making so many movies as compared to other traditional production companies? Well, why do we need a handmade book when we can just have it printed? Why should I pay to watch one movie in a theater when I can have access to a whole library of movies at home? Sure, the book is less beautiful, the movie not as fulfilling, but I'm starting to forget what a beautiful book is, what a fulfilling movie is. Is this beautiful? Well, there's no going back now because it doesn't pay to illuminate anymore, and it's easier to light all of these scenes the same. Everyone's doing it, so that must mean it's better. Wait, when was everyone doing this? By making more movies, whether they're good or not, a manner of production becomes normalized, overtaking and eventually destroying older systems. Movies made for theaters are affected by the box office. There's a lot of pressure to make a good film or else you'll lose money. Risk is involved for each individual film, so decisions must be made carefully. But movies made for streaming services are supported by a subscription. Maybe they'll be looked over or forgotten, but nonetheless, they'll fill up a library and encourage people to keep paying. The pressure to make a good movie is not needed because it will make money either way, just as a printed novella is bought and can be stored on the shelf, never to be touched again. Alright, circling back to my original question, with the oversaturation of middle-tier movies in today's film landscape, are there historical equivalents? Well, there's pretty much always been what you could consider middle to lower tier entertainment. Penny Dreadfuls or dime novels would be a good pre-film example of this. In the 1860s, Varney the Vampire, Spring Heeled Jack, and the American equivalents, Buffalo Bill stories, Secret Service, the Jesse James stories, were all prevalent among a young, lower-class audience in Britain and America. These stories were cheap and fast reads, primarily about the adventures of a single heroine that people could idealize. Women authors and women readers generated a large market of romance stories as well. Pulp fiction soon followed in the 1890s, printed on cheap pulpwood paper to lower the cost of making the novels as much as possible. Like dime novels and penny dreadfuls, the stories in pulp magazines were certainly not the most thoughtful, the writing not necessarily top-notch, but the characters were memorable, and served as a means of escape from everyday life for many people. Yes, these narratives and figures were mass-produced by large corporations, but it feels unjust to write them off as something made for a quick buck. The individual quality of each story shined through as each author got to showcase work that people were clearly benefiting from in some way, shape, or form. This type of fiction existed in a system of already established literature, which left pulp in the lower tiers of cultural relevance until it died out. But film was a wholly new thing, appearing in the 1880s and 1890s. If you think about it, it feels like a lot of older films tend to be held in higher regard than ones we see now. Just like the Iliad or the Tale of Genji are praised and studied, films like The General or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari represent pieces of art that no one had ever created before, with societal elements from their time periods bleeding into the work. Once there existed prehistoric oral storytelling traditions, just as a number of films were likely created in the early 1900s. But only some stories were written down, and only a number of film reels weren't destroyed, prevailing through time and deemed meaningful enough by someone. By 1912, movie production companies like Universal Pictures, MGM, and Warner Brothers began establishing themselves in Hollywood. And to make sure they had an audience for their films, they started building their own movie theaters as well. So these companies essentially had control over how and which films were produced, as well as the manner in which they were distributed and shown to a wider audience. although this was eventually prohibited by the US government in 1948 because it violated antitrust laws, or laws in place to, quote, prohibit anti-competitive conduct and mergers that deprive American consumers. It sounds familiar to what streaming services are doing with their films right now. When the manner of viewing a film is contained to one platform, so you as a consumer have to go out and buy subscriptions to each streaming service to watch 5 different films, and also if you wanted to see a streaming service film in a theater, tough luck because that's bad for business. I feel like that's not working for the consumers, it's working against them. Back to the matter at hand. So you had these production companies cropping up and film is maturing. Now we're in the 1930s and there's sound, and also there were critics, specifically moral critics. Enter the Hays Code in 1934, which did away with showing anything morally dubious on camera. So there's the obvious no homosexuals, profanity, no long sensual kissing, that kind of thing. Oh, and then there's also no making fun of the church, no white slavery. Of course, it's fine if you show enslaved African Americans, and also no man and woman can be seen in a bed together at all. There's a ton of other things, but the important thing here is censorship. Art is being essentially self-regulated by a private company producing films for the public. So this is the context that the golden age of Hollywood existed in. Now you have 8 major production companies: Paramount, MGM, Fox, RKO Pictures, Warner Brothers, Universal Pictures, Columbia Pictures, and United Artists. And these companies were mass-producing films, more than 50 a year, but they were good. Yes, narratives were controlled, contracts restricted actors, theaters were monopolized, and yet the movies from this era are iconic. There were low-budget westerns or horror movies shoved into the roster, of course, which could represent the equivalent straight-to-streaming, straight-to-DVD movies we have today. But like Pulp Fiction, they still had value, and they were part of the theater-going experience. And people knew they were cheap. They would spend their hard-earned money expecting to see a B-grade film or two, as well as some really good ones. Again, I'm not excusing any of the business tactics afoot here, but you can't deny the amount of hard work and blatant artistry in these movies. I think what made this especially possible was the creative specializations of each company. For example, MGM focused on telling stories about the elite, Universal was focused on horror movies, and Warner Brothers was all about crime and thrillers. So each company stuck to one narrative and filming style, and were subsequently able to refine their films instead of trying to make every type of film at once. This created a rich landscape of really high quality and varied work that spanned across multiple genres. Business-wise, I'd say this era fits closest to what the current filmmaking landscape looks like, but creatively it's entirely different. Now we have productions concerned with creating movies for every single genre, which results in lower quality movies in each area. Instead of sharing and recognizing their differences, allowing each other to exist in the same space, now these companies are all competing to take up that space entirely, working against one another and against their consumers. Okay, real quick, let's talk about blockbusters. Although the term was around in the 1940s describing a big budget film for the masses, it really took off with Jaws and Star Wars. Blockbusters were initially all about spectacle and play. A giant shark, lightsaber battles, an amusement park with dinosaurs. It was a child's imagination brought to life, with memorable characters and vibrant visuals. It was Pulp Fiction on screen. But when movie studios, and more importantly, the rich people and corporations buying these studios, realized how much money blockbusters could make, how many audiences they could reach and subsequently sell products to, well, I think you can guess. Paul Risker puts it very well in his article, The Long Complex Evolution of the Blockbuster. Technology has dehumanized the blockbuster in how they relate to our inner child. Whereas earlier blockbusters shared an intimacy with the physical expression of play, now there's a distance. These CGI-heavy films have dehumanized this intimate connection that cinema once shared. It's not only technology that has stimulated this decline of the blockbuster, but the lack of creative ambition and commitment to a series. The superhero genre, notably Spider-Man and Batman, has seen numerous reboots. Couple this with the reliance on a limited number of franchises, the lack of courage to develop new stories, characters, and world building in favor of tapping into established fan bases, and the result is a decline in quality for the blockbuster. So, did I answer my question? Kinda. I don't know, I jumped around a lot, but here's a recap. So, mass production is great because it makes art accessible. Streaming services give filmmakers a place to showcase their work. Except, the art being created might not be of the same quality as it once was, because it must conform to the standards of its production. The individual artistic voice is essentially supplemented by a larger quantity of watered-down content, aiming to appeal to everyone. More content equals more viewers equals more money. Right now, said content is overly sanitized, almost too clean. The visuals are neutral and lacking intention. That's likely because trying to check all of those genre boxes for mass appeal, while also attempting to produce as many movies as possible, can't be done without some kind of standardization. But unlike the golden age of Hollywood, there's not really a stylistic distinction that any one studio is trying to go for. With all of that being said, I don't think it's fair to say that we found an exact historical parallel to what's going on right now in entertainment. And I guess I wasn't exactly expecting to find one, but rather understand how we got here. There basically has and always will be middle to low tier entertainment available for the masses to consume. Furthermore, someone with a lot of money and little care for artistry will often be pulling the strings, monopolizing, censoring, and controlling what we are allowed to consume. But as of late, it feels like entertainment disguised as mass production and access for all is actually trying to consume, replicate, and then dispose of our individual creative capabilities, until we all make up one library composed of identical monochrome pages, who have forgotten the materials and techniques used to make ourselves colorful and different.